Okay, so we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to the final. We have arrived to our final module for this series. This is module 4. This one I'm really excited about, especially because, of course, we have here Monique Willisey and Joseph Galawengo from the TDSB, and they are here to talk about their module, Africentric Education and Black Joy, answering questions as well. But specifically, I think we all want to know basically everything behind the scenes. I know that it was really difficult in terms of cutting information because there was so much there and so many resources. So yes, very much looking forward to what you both have to say. Take it away.
Thanks, Flor.
No problem.
Good evening, everyone. I know one of the names there. I see Reshma. I'm like, is that Reshma? Probably.
Welcome, Reshma. So glad you could join us.
Reshma. Is it okay if I let Monique lead? Because you were like, take it away. I'm like, oh, what do I do now? Did you want to say?
It's fine. I think, when Joseph and I were asked about this project, we were really excited about exploring something that's really passionate for both of us, which is Africentric education, and always centering that from a joy perspective, not shying away from the trauma, and not hiding it or downplaying it, but also remember that that's not the end all and be all, and that's not the beginning either. And so when we were kind of exploring exactly what we were going to do and how to structure this module, there was a lot of conversations and the first draft of our script was insanely long because there was just so much we individually wanted to talk about.
It was so long. And maybe we have a part 2, like already in the vault.
True. So we kind of decided to break it down into 7 steps, kind of looking at both pre-colonial or colonial Africa and the African diaspora, but also throughout, and what that looked like and how it evolved through an Africentric educational lens, and really kind of starting with the contributions and ending with this idea of values and celebrating and the recognition specifically in language courses and how that can be done.
Yeah, thank you for that, Monique. And I would echo a lot of what Monique said. I was really excited by Flor's invitation to write this module, and all these pieces are really, really crucial for educators to think about. So I'll if you take a look at the module, number 4 is called Black Plurality. And that's just based on the idea that Black people, our cultures, our experiences, our perspectives are so multi-layered and so diverse. And so, if you have concepts in equity education, such as, culturally responsive pedagogy, you might find yourself, or educators might find themselves, taking steps like bringing Black voices into the curriculum, Black experiences, whether it's STEM or arts or math or whatever the case may be. The next step to think about is, how do we make sure that these perspectives, Black perspectives, are diverse or are authentic ones? And that means you have to recognize that, there are so many different types of Black cultures and experiences. And then going quite deep, number 6 is dismantling whiteness, right? And so that's based on the idea of all of this equity education that we do. We find ourselves doing it on Turtle Island, right? As a response to colonialism and white supremacy, right? So even the idea of people of African descent identifying ourselves as Black, that's just a response to the creation of this thing called white, which is just a sociological arm of white supremacy and colonialism, where Europeans, starting from the British and the Portuguese and so on, the Dutch and so on and so forth, were identified as white, to delineate themselves from the people who are conquered and subjugating. So all that stuff is what Monique and I were thinking about, and we put into our big pot for this module. And so that represents the depth and the critical thinking and the fact that there's so many pieces to this work. But I will give credit to TDSB System Superintendent Karen Murray, who is also a contemporary and the research partner of Dr. Nicole West Burns, who kind of put in my mind the idea of Black joy. And when you're talking about people who may be subject to colonization or marginalization, so Black identities, Black people in this case, you want to start with joy, right? Start with their brilliance, their achievement. Talking about any people's history, start with joy. Even I was gonna mention, we find ourselves now wrestling with how to. Well, some educators find themselves wrestling with how do we critically discuss the conflict and the situation in Palestine with people from Palestinian descent and people who are living in Israel. And thinking about this, you want to start with people's authentic history and try and start with a place that positively affirms them, right? So that's kind of where that idea came from, is starting with joy. And the last thing I'll say, because this for me was a really great experience in my journey as someone who is doing deep equity work and learning about these terms and then learning about how to apply critical thinking to them. So I have a lot of artifacts too. So this is Cultivating Genius by Goldie Muhammad. So she's really good at articulating a definition of joy as, not just, something that is producing good feelings, but something that is connected to self-empowerment and liberation of people and long-lasting and very, very deep. So that's kind of the perspective I have to offer on what I was bringing to the work and what went into dividing the module into 7 different sections, and also the discussion questions that we added.
And I think for me, one of the greatest things that I really wanted people to get out of this module was what Africentric curriculum or pedagogy is, but also what it isn't. I think some people kind of only think that Africentric curriculum or pedagogy is only for students of African descent or from the African diaspora. And they don't understand that it's a multi-centric approach that's beneficial for all students. And that it's also this idea that it's not separate. It is something that all students benefit from. Because all students are miseducated, right? Like when they are not provided with all the pieces that make up this complete picture of who we are here on Turtle Island as Canadian people. But it's also the greatest contrast to Eurocentrism. And when we're looking at specifically FSL teaching, there does tend to be a default to very Eurocentric approaches. And it's really important to disrupt that. And we do this by allowing students to learn about themselves, but also others. And that became, something of really great importance for us when it comes to FSLs in particular. And then, just to kind of throw a question out to the group, we had a series of questions that we were hoping would make the audience kind of really pause and reflect. And we staggered them throughout the module. And one thing I just ask is, how have you been trained in including the contributions from the African diaspora into your teaching? And what have you had to unlearn?
Yeah. I would say the questions in my view and in my practice are the thing that I go to the most in terms of a strategy in my pedagogy or part of my toolbox because it forces reflection. And I also find that it's even a disarming way to work with educators. So I spend most of my time working with other educators as opposed to other students about equity work. So if you look at the introduction and guiding questions for part one, here's the next one. How will you set conditions for an intersectional approach in your practice, which opens space for various African identities and expressions? So setting conditions is a really important thing to think about in terms of Afrocentric education or the idea of Black joy, because it's one thing to get some resources, plan a lesson in a unit, and try and deliver it. It's another thing to think about, okay, when we're doing this work with students, what are the conditions, meaning how are things being set up so that I might be including a lot of different voices, or I'm prepared to pivot if I have to, or am I as an educator, and are the students able to handle a situation where a difficult question comes up, or I might not have an answer to this question, or any number of things. So an example that a lot of teachers in the GTA encounter with Black students is the differences between Black students who are newcomers from the continent, newcomers from the Caribbean, or newcomers from the States, and what they bring into the school system in regards to their Black identity. And for example, some students don't even feel comfortable being referred to as Black because for example, their nationality or the national identity from back home might be Somali or Nigerian or from Ghana or something like that. Not necessarily, the nomenclature or the terminology of being Black in the context of North America is new to them, and not something that they have fit into yet. And so that's an interesting condition of, looking at the intersections of Black students and Black communities in this part of the world, in Toronto being so multicultural. And it takes a lot of thinking to prepare to make sure that all those different potential intersections and the results of those intersections are going to be honored in a way that can still make the learning deep and meaningful, as opposed to the train going right off the tracks. So that takes a lot of thinking, and I say that because me as a learning coach, I'm in my third year of doing like very intense equity work, and I've done that thinking and been in rooms where we share some of those questions and those considerations.
And I'll just echo what Joseph was saying, from an FSL perspective, when we're looking at educators or when we're looking at the resources we're using, are you prepared yourself? Like, what research have you done? What work have you done? And are you also prepared to be a student in the classroom learning along with your students? Nobody's an expert. Teachers are lifelong learners as well. And if you're not willing to be vulnerable in this work, especially when it comes to the idea of centering Africentric pedagogy and dismantling pedagogy in the classroom, then you're doing both yourself and students a disservice. And I see a question from Floor.
From Floor?
Oh, sorry, just having trouble with my mouse apparently. So I just have actually a comment and a question. So the comment is, and I was mentioning at the start of this that I'm currently doing racial literacy series with Dr. Nicole Westburns. And one thing that we had touched on yesterday was when it comes to specifically choosing resources, specifically literacy resources that center Black joy, that center Afrocentric education, making sure that just because, so she gave an example of, and this is an actual situation of a teacher that chose, I don't remember the title of the book, but basically it was a book that had research proving that Black athletes are naturally, and in terms of the science and all of that, better in terms of running capabilities, etc. And so there was a teacher that said, oh, look, I'm doing this in my class, and felt very proud. And so kind of asked us like how we would react. And so from that, what came from that is that just because you're still feeding into the stereotype, you're still feeding into a lot of those tropes, and you're still feeding into the idea that just because there is a person of color on the cover, just because of all of these things, it doesn't mean that that is a resource that should be used in the classroom. Because by using that resource, what that's doing is that's feeding into the stereotypes. And so it's actually doing the opposite. And so my question to both of you is, when it comes to, because that is very, very difficult, and Monique and I have had many conversations as well about choosing resources that are not just ticking a box because there's a person of color in that film or in that book, but choosing resources that are
Is
authentic
it
and
that
truthful.
difficult, Flora?
No, it's
I'm
not.
sorry.
It's not difficult.
I'm
Oh
sorry.
no, and I'm not
We're
saying
just
it's
keeping it
difficult.
real
It's
a
just,
little bit. I'm sorry.
sorry.
Go
Let
ahead.
me
No, go
rephrase
ahead.
that.
No,
Not that it's
please.
difficult
I
to
shouldn't
do
have done
that.
that.
Sorry, no. What I meant to say is, sorry, I
No,
don't mean to say that it's
I'm being
difficult to
disruptive.
do that. Yeah, but I just meant to say that it's difficult to communicate that to other individuals,
No,
them to
I get it.
understand that
I
that's
get it.
not. And so for those that are starting in their journey, how would you say are ways to approach that in terms of when you're selecting your resource, to do it with a critical eye and a critical lens, so that you're not feeding into those stereotypes and you're not feeding into the box ticking?
Yeah, I love this question. That's why I jumped in. For the educators who are just starting, I would say they should be encouraged to think about, maybe even start with stereotypes, and stereotypes that have been popular or have been used in time, connected to Black cultures, Black students, Black people, such as, very athletic, very artistic, whatever the case may be. Maybe not stereotypes that downgrade academic achievement and brilliance and intellectualism. And then, so I think the stereotypes is one good lens to look at, and then also look at our commitment as educators, to make sure the brilliance of all students is allowed to be fostered and allowed to be supported in the classroom. So are Black students doing well in your school, in your class? Maybe yes, maybe no. We know what the data shows that they are not, right? So it's like data about academic achievement. And then if you're looking at resources, do the resources have some stereotypes in them? And there's a thing called counter narratives that is part of equity work. So a lot of times counter narratives are, stories or narratives or scenarios that go against the popular stereotypes. And oftentimes that's a strategy to dismantle a lot of negative narratives about Black students, Black people. So that's something that I would encourage educators to look at. Okay, are there some counter narratives? Or another way of looking at it is like, who's seen, who's unseen, or what stories are told, what stories are untold. So we know all the stories about Black athletes, their achievements, and how their achievements are used to inspire so many different people, and Black people in particular. But what other achievements are not centered or are not told? And I think that's a good way to go. So yeah, this is what I was going to say. A number of years ago, this was around the time when The Hate You Give came out, and we're really honored by Angie Thomas's career. I was in Indigo not so long ago, and I think she's doing like not sci-fi, but some other genres of writing. But around that time, Hate You Give came out. This is, let me see, 2018, 19. Then there were a number of other books like Dear Martin and Ghost Boys. And if you think about young adult novels, and even before The Hate You Give came out, and this comes from my experience as an English ACL, looking at English assistant curriculum leader in grade 9 classroom, trying to build up my classroom library and find different books that have Black characters in them. A lot of them were about Black characters who were victims of gun violence, right? Just to put that plainly, whether it's graphic novels or regular novels, and that's something that we realized. And it's an example of narratives that are are not uncommon, and I would say are overly used and associated with victimhood and violence, and don't create room for other experiences of Black people in books. You know what I mean? So a lot of books about Black people in athletics or Black people going through many different struggles. And most recently, after the Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, you know, pushing back and responding to gun violence, but not enough about Black people just being in families doing family stuff, or being in sci-fi settings or STEM settings or any of the other things other than civil rights, sports, and guns. You know what I mean? So so the long-winded. I'm being long-winded, but counter narratives. Um, and are who's being seen, who's being unseen, what stories are told, what stories are not being told, and those lenses, are they contributing to opportunities for Black students to show their brilliance, show their full selves? Because that's what the joy is, right? Showing your full self.
And I think, just to add on to what Joseph is talking about, is that when it comes to choosing FSL resources, it becomes even more difficult, because so much of what is available to teachers is produced and does come from a very Eurocentric lens. But it is incumbent upon us to do that work, that legwork. So 3 questions that I had put out into the module were: does the film or the media tap into students' interests, prior knowledge, and does it have a diverse representation of French language use? Meaning, is it always standardized French, quote unquote standardized French? Are you able to hear accents from throughout the diaspora? Right? Or is it very much a contrived type of film? Does the resource reinforce? So what Joseph was talking about, does it perpetuate or highlight stereotypes or misrepresentations of specific groups? And I think one of the things is that sometimes teachers might over purge. So especially in FSL, it's a time where even if we use a film that has certain stereotypes, that's not to say that we cannot address it with another counter story. So in the module, I particularly took on Les Intouchables, because it's a film that every French teacher has used at some point. Like, we've all seen it. We understand it's a great story. Omar Sy did an incredible job in his role in that film. But the one thing that really took me back was how much the film was a stereotype of this idea of almost like a Black caricature, that he really did, or the directors wrote a script that played in to this idea of what Black men are in the most negative ways. And though he broke the stereotypes at times throughout the film, it wasn't enough to replace the fact that the way the character was meant to be portrayed was this like man who was from this like disenfranchised background, who had served time in prison, who was a thief, who was only trying to live off of the government, who was only trying to, get money for free, who, all of these very negative stereotypes that we know in France continue. And so and because it's a film that it's a humoristic film, people don't see it and take it in as critically. They see it and they're like, oh, well, it's just funny. It's not real. It's like, but it is very real. These are stereotypes that Black men face day in and day out, and Black people face day in and day out. So when you do use a movie like Omar Sy, or like Les Intouchables with Omar Sy, he's amazing and he's brilliant, and that should be celebrated. But what if you contrast his representation in that film with Lupin, with how brilliant he is in Lupin, or Les Tirailleurs, which is a film that was just released last January, which serves multiple curriculums. It's a film set in World War I, and it's about les Senegalese tirailleurs, who are, in English it's called Father and Son, and it talks about this whole idea of decolonization. Like, what happens when you refuse to serve in an unjust war for unjust causes? So it shows you a whole nother perspective of his acting and a whole nother dimension to that. So it's not to say don't use resources that may be stereotypical, but also challenge them. How do you bring that in class and actually help your students to critically think and engage with a material? How do you address these misrepresentations?
I would say those questions are really essential to bringing resources in, and that's part of the setting conditions. Like, before we show the film, we're going to have these conversations, and the conversations are going to reveal what we know, where we are, and where we are not. And then how do you act accordingly to achieve the goal that you're trying to achieve with the film? Nice question, Teresa. Should we just go for it, or?
Yeah, I see Teresa's comment. So she said, my students are loving hearing French songs and watching the videos from diverse voices chosen from Marnie Musical Site. It has been a great jumping off point into exploring other countries where they speak French, hearing different accents, considering diverse lived experiences, and experiencing other socio cultural expressions also. Yes. And one thing I'll say is that what we're seeing is more and more resources are intentionally being created that disrupt these stereotypical and, let's face it, Eurocentrically created narratives. So a resource I mentioned is Forte Libre, which is a distinctively Canadian source. But we also see resources from Portrait d'un enfant, for example, which is from another website, and that features student or children across the Francophone diaspora, different accents, different lived experiences, all joyfully. They may not have what another student might have, but very joyfully. And one thing that stood out to me is that a lot of times we think of the African diaspora as this kind of they're missing things, right? It's always a deficit. And the Portrait d'un enfant, it represents students, a lot of them within the continent of Africa from various countries, in a positive light, from a position of joy. One of the
Oh, sorry, Monique, sorry to interrupt you. Jean says, what were those two resources you mentioned just now before you move on?
Oh, what were the two resources? Sorry, I didn't scroll down. Okay, so one is Forte Libre, and it is a series of short videos focused on Black Canadian history. So there is that. And then the other one is Portrait d'un enfant. And I think that's by Arte TV. And they are the links are available for a certain amount of time, and then they replace them. They always have different kids. I think every year they have a new batch. And what's really interesting is that one of them was a girl who was an equestrian. So something that is stereotypically considered a not Black art form or sport, and her grandmother was a writer. She was a writer. She had won a lot of medals. She was the Senegalese champion. So again, this idea of disrupting the narratives. And
sorry, Monique, I know Angeline had a question. Her hand was up earlier.
Hi, sorry. Thank you. I just was thinking to myself that the other day we were having a conversation about an environmental book, and the cover very much was advertising to what it didn't actually support. So it was supporting diversity in science, but it really didn't. The book, but the cover was really trying to get people to buy it. So I was just thinking of how important it is for us, myself, to develop a critical enough lens to be able to discern is that worthy of using or not. Not so much a question, just it was just a conversation at the board office the other day.
Worthy of using, and then if you're using it, how are you using it with your students? Meaning, like, is there going to be some type of outcome? So that's why, because I mean, my background is in secondary, and sometimes the outcome or the goal is just to get through the curriculum, right? And then make sure, you know, the students, if you know, the marks are a part of that as well. But if we're being more critical with our pedagogy, thinking about things like, okay, are we going to make sure some unheard voices or unheard stories are told, and maybe even, you know, told by students, or we are told in a way that encourages students to see themselves in their curriculum? Then one question that requires some deep thinking will lead to another question, which will then lead to some empowerment or some, you know, some deepening of our work in a culturally responsive way. So that's
and I think no, really great point. And one of the things that I do think that in terms of as educators, when you are implementing an Africentric approach, one thing is to always think about what are students getting out of it. Is it just, are you giving them this assignment or this assessment to generate a comment, to generate a mark, and you're kind of trying to take this very traditional Eurocentric task and you're like slapping words like Black Joy or like Black History on it and you're giving it to them, but you actually deconstructed the assignment? Have you actually changed the goals that the assignment is trying to meet? Because for an Afrocentric pedagogy, the idea is to develop critical thinking skills that decolonize the curriculum, but also question and challenge that colonial discourse, right? So the things that students are supposed to be doing, they're supposed to be developing, you know, productive, but also constructive strategies for change. So if your assignment is really not meeting those outcomes and it's not necessarily really disrupting an assignment that you already have in place, then it's not really an Africentric perspective and pedagogy.
So I had a couple of questions for both of you. The first question is, because we talked a lot about the things that we have to do, of course, in the classroom. What would you advise for, let's say we see, and I guess it touches a little bit on what I had mentioned before, but if we see a colleague in our department using a resource, whether it be a film, a book, whatever it might be, that is inappropriate, that is discriminatory, speaks to those stereotypes, and what kind of advice would you give to educators to disrupt that? Because oftentimes, of course, we do what we do in our classroom, and then that's when we talk about those uncomfortable conversations. But we definitely have a role as well in terms of responsibility if we see colleagues doing that. So, how would you, I guess, stress the importance of also disrupting what somebody else is doing, that they shouldn't, using resources they should not be doing, and how to go about that in a way that, of course, we still want to be collegial and professional, but also not stay in silence, which is, I know, very difficult.
Joseph, I'll let you take this one first, because yes.
You know, it's funny, when Flora started the question, I'm like, I'm going to let Monique go first.
I can go first.
No, I'm gonna go first, and you're gonna get to the good stuff. But I'll just lead by an experience that I had, and this was with a colleague in an English department setting who wanted to stick with more traditional canon material that was not culturally responsive at all, and so okay. So one thing I didn't do was approach in kind of a one-off scenario, such as, like, you know, you might consider using these resources instead of that resources. It was very much a conversation and relationship-based piece. So I don't really have strategies on how to, you know, redirect the use of curriculum through, a single interaction or singular interactions. For me, it's been successful with relationship building. So essentially I honored the teacher's skills and understood kind of what she was trying to do with the students, which was just kind of more skill-based and intellectual-based, right? Critical thinking, making connections with essays and that kind of thing. And then through conversations, I would share what I was doing with identity and how to bring some of the other voices. I think one of the books we were looking at was Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez, and also Brother by David Cheriandi. And so I was able to use those books first to bring in some new perspectives about Black and racialized people in the classroom. And then over the course of sharing what I'd done, then convince the colleague to incorporate some of these resources because of the results that I had, and because it still contributed to the work of what we were trying to do, the work as English teachers, teaching critical thinking skills through some rich novels. So I had to model, and also model through a relationship with the teacher. But that's a privilege because I was able to have working relationships with these teachers where we can talk about the work, the resources, the results, that kind of thing. Sometimes you don't have that relationship, and that's where Monique is going to pick up. See, that's
okay. All right, just throw it at me
because I believe in you.
So one thing I'll say is that when it comes to disrupting, when educators in your department or in another department are using, it could be resources, it could be lesson-based materials that are not culturally responsive and could actually do harm. I think one of the first steps is that as a school, there needs to be a level of expectation of the fact that there needs to be culturally responsive resources and implementation of pedagogy in the class. And that also requires that the ACLs are on board with looking at what is in their departments and critically analyzing why. Because again, if a resource is just there as busy work, then that busy work cannot then be used to supplement an Africentric approach. That does not correlate. In terms of with a colleague, I do what Joseph does. I do a lot of modeling. So I'm fortunate enough to have a lot of colleagues who will say, Monique, I'm doing this, or Monique, what about this, or Monique, what about that? And so a conversation I had with a colleague was about the DEFLA. So those of us who are FSL teachers, we know that in the senior year, sometimes this conversation comes up. And the DEFLA is by far one of the most Eurocentric things ever, but it's also like really nice for kids to kind of have an experience of doing this testing and getting an official certificate as well. However, you can take this very Eurocentric test and look at it and examine it through an Africentric perspective. And what I said to the colleague was, what if students, they all come with knowledge. They all come with a wealth of knowledge and backgrounds. What if they all wrote a different part of the DEFLA themselves? What if that was part of the rich task that they did? And that they genuinely focused on bringing to light, potentially, because part of the DEFLA is reading. What if they were reading books from people throughout the African diaspora? Aimé Césaire. Well, I don't think any of our students are reading La Négritude, but just, as an example. But what if they actually were given the ability to do deep, rich thinking, right? Trusting students to contribute, to not be teacher-centered and focused, but to say, what if we redo this test and look at it and make it more globally responsive and relevant. We dismantle and we deconstruct. We look at, who does this relate to? We're talking about Alsace-Lorraine. Who even knows where that is? So what if we replace reading about Alsace-Lorraine with Guadeloupe, for example, because there are students who are from Guadeloupe or who at least know where it is. Or you replace it with Timmins. So I think that's really important when you're having these conversations with teachers, is to say, what, I understand where you're going and this is amazing. However, what if we do this? Because, and I think being a critical friend, and this is something that we talked about in our last PLC session, is really important at this point. An anti-racist educator cannot be afraid of discomfort, because the moment you are, then you're not growing yourself. And it takes time. I'm not saying that this is like going to happen overnight, but little things like, oh, I understand where you're going, like Joseph was talking about, but what is the end goal? Like, what are students supposed to learn from this? Because if it's just curriculum, then where is the culturally responsive pedagogy part of it? And I think I see some comments here.
Yeah, and I'll just say kudos to everything Monique so eloquently said. And a lot of what she said is based on the culture of the school, right? So the expectations that are set by ACLs, by administrators, there are so many schools where those expectations are not really set deeply enough for a number of reasons. So, for example, in the post-pandemic world, there are a lot of new administrators. There's a lot of turnover and you know, just people moving around. So that's one cause of confusion or a lack of culturally responsive and anti-racist foundation in schools. And so some of that language is part of the culture of the school. You know, anti-racist educators and things like that. And it's actually the question you asked, Fleur, made me laugh because this is a really hard thing to do. Because the examples that Monique and I both shared are the examples where the culture is set, whether it's the department or the school. And then the idea of an anti-racist educator can't be afraid to be uncomfortable. But another thing I would say is, and there's also a safety piece, right? Because sometimes this work makes educators feel unsafe. And so I'm just honoring the gravity of the question and all the things that have to be in place to make small but meaningful steps day by day, so on and so on.
And just to address, Angelique had a question or a comment that many students use the DEFA to enter post-secondary programs and jobs. Absolutely. And the thing is, the DEFA is not an exam that's set by educators, right? Like it's set by a different entity outside of the TDSB. What I'm saying is that in preparing students to take the DEFLA, one thing that educators can do is look at it through a culturally responsive pedagogical approach. You can still be just as rigorous, like an Africentric pedagogical approach is incredibly rigorous. So you can still look at DEFLA material or DEFLA level material and change the context in order to be more culturally responsive. And so that's something that I'm working with some colleagues to do as well.
Mm-hmm.
Queen has her hand up.
Who has their hand up?
Hi, it's me.
Oh, Jean.
Hi. Hi, Monique. Hi, Joseph.
Hello.
I wanted to respond to what Angelique said as well. I think it comes back to what the two of you, Monique and Joseph, were saying about a balanced approach and then also counter narratives. So like the DELF is the DELF is the DELF. We know what it is. We know we know where it comes from. We know what it contains. There's also we also know that the approach that it takes can be quite effective. It's also limiting in its approach, but it's quite effective. for many people. But it also comes back to what I think Chimamanda Adichie said, which is about the danger of the single story. We don't want one single story. So we don't want one single story of one type of Black identity. We don't want one single story of what Francophone looks like. We don't want one single story of one Black actor from one French-speaking Black actor. So, like, I like your idea, and I'm intrigued by the work that you're doing, Monique, in helping to deconstruct what the DELF process looks like, and then also thinking about like we don't use the DELF in our curriculum at our school. I teach at an independent school. It is a separate thing that students can choose. So I would say they're systematics, they're institutionally, it is not something that we have to teach. No student takes the exam that they don't want to take. And then in our departmental work, we want to ensure that we are balancing whatever is coming into students' brains via DELF is being problematized and questioned, and then balanced with a nuanced view of what France is, what Europe is, what the rest of the world is, what other kinds of accents and dialects and peoples are. I think one thing that we're personally working on is, and we're a 1 to 12 school, so that is a big scope and sequence, but is like one of the long-term plans is scope and sequencing basically our anti-oppressive approach from 1 all the way through to 12. And my follow-up question was actually going to, after I finished this thought, was going to be the 1 to 8 range in core French, because I think that is often a big question for language educators, as I often find that I can do a lot more in FSF3U than I feel I can do in grade 8 core French. But I think that when I reduce it to, I am just providing balanced, nuanced approach to who the students are seeing and what they are hearing, that's at least a good place to start. So I would love to hear for the two of you, your thoughts around like taking that approach. Right now I'm teaching high school as well. So I empathize, Joseph, but I started in 4 to 6. So I know the struggle is real. I would love to hear your thoughts about how to take an Africentric approach in younger years, and then also in core French.
Okay. Absolutely, I agree. So I started off as an elementary teacher, so I will definitely talk about that. And elementary core and immersion. So I did see like the two sides as well. And what I will say is, especially in those primary years, so I've done kindergarten, I've done grade 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8 as well. So one of the things when it comes to those elementary years is there are a growing number of teacher resources out there that other teachers are sharing with each other in order to give context to the nuances of language, right? So I think, and as much as FSL teachers want to promote only speaking French in class, if students don't have that vocabulary at all, like they have no idea what the word is for Afrocentric, you can start there. Word walls are amazing in the younger years, because then students can start to do things like picture association. Like, what does this mean? How are they breaking it down? How do they relate to themselves? But also visually, what does your classroom look like? Is it an inviting space for this idea of an anti-racist approach or an Africentric approach. Like when teachers want to decorate a classroom, are they getting the input of the students? And absolutely, there is that pushback when it comes to maintaining the target language. And I'm not saying don't maintain the target language, but in terms of differentiated instructions with students, I'm not saying have like a word wall in English. What I'm saying is you have like Africentric, and then you are explaining to students what that means in French, maybe through images. You're getting them to make those word associations, Books. There's more and more books that are being published in French that focus on an Africentric lens or anti-racist lens in general. So again, like what books are we buying? Are the books reflective of the students in our classrooms and the diversity that we're seeing in front of us? When it comes to students and that idea of an inviting space, an inviting environment, what does the classroom look like? Like, what does the setting look like? Are students being included when it comes to those assessments? Something as small as writing a story that includes their name in French can make all the difference. I've taught math and French where I use like my students' names in the problems, for example, and it makes all the difference. They love it. They're more engaged, but taking the time to learn more about them and their culture. And
Their
they're
families
teaching
as well.
us
Yeah.
as much as we're teaching them, right? Like they're teaching us as much as we're teaching them. So in order to really, and one of the biggest things when it comes to French is to get students to buy in and not resist. Well, one of the ways of getting them to buy in is to make it more inclusive of them. Like if I see myself in your classroom, then I want to be in that classroom. Like I want to be educated. Like I'm going in knowing that I can read a book, I can see a poster, like I'm going to get word problems. I'm going to have carpet time with all of these resources.
All I would add to that, because that was brilliant, is that once you start including the students, you invite or you open the door to include their families as well. And then if this can be embedded, so it's throughout the whole course year, whereas they're included, they're reflected throughout the whole course year, then you've established the condition that it's a deep, and it's a deep reflection, meaning as opposed to something that's performative, right? So sometimes at the beginning of the year, we will do a get to know you activity. Students will, create activities about themselves. They might go on the wall, but then that might not continue, right? But if we can continue that so that they are part of the learning and they're reflected learning all the way through, I think then we're actually getting into a situation where it's Afrocentric, it's decolonized because it's no longer centered upon, European ideals, like Monique was saying, but it's centered upon how they are reflected in their own cultures and identity.
And just to go back to core French, one of the things that I used to do is that I would have questions written in French, but then under it, I would have the English translation. So students who maybe don't understand every word I'm saying, they can look at an anchor chart in the class that I've made or that they have made. And they're like, oh, same way we translate like que, qui, quand for students, why wouldn't we translate the word inclusion? Why wouldn't we talk about identity? Like it's the same way we do it. We do use English words in French to help students, especially in grade 4 when they start learning French. And that's specifically core. We do that. It's just a matter of expanding that list of what we help them to do. Our aim is not to have students who just have a list of vocab words they know. Our aim is to have students who have vocabulary to help them express themselves. So an activity I typically do with core students when I was in elementary is with my grade 4s, I would say, like, what is the meaning of your name? D'où vient ton nom? What does it mean? Why? Who gave you that name and why? And we would treat it almost like a show and tell. Like students, they go home, they do research, they would come back, and they get to use all the vocabulary you're teaching them. Maman, papa, mes grands-parents, like all of these things. But you also get to, and they'll say, I did not know how to say this word in French. Okay, that's a teachable moment. And I used to leave them up on the walls. And then we would come back at the end of the year and students will have added things about themselves. And it became an idea that the classroom was just a reflection of them. They looked at class and it was just a reflection of them and their identities throughout the year.
Okay, so just before, thank you so much, Monique, and thank you, Jean, for your question. We do have, Caitlin has her hand up for another question just before we wrap up.
Thank you. It's been really great to listen in and to learn a lot. So my question is, I teach in an area that is not very diverse at all. It is a very, Eurocentric, white population. So it's like you're talking about how to, include and like so that they see themselves in the classroom and stuff, but I don't have that. So I'm just wondering how to best approach, bringing those diverse voices in, because I do as much as I can, but is there a better way to bring them in to teach my students like about diverse voices and stuff in the classroom and with the Afrocentric like approach?
So one thing I'll say is that when I was teaching at a school that was not really diverse, I actually, for my core students, one of the best language teaching tools I created was to have them buddy up with another school. And so they almost had like, it was like a pen pal, like old school assignment, and they do emails back and forth, like me and another teacher, we would like coordinate this. And it was great because it exposed them to so much. But one thing I will say, Caitlin, is that just because there's not as much cultural diversity in your classroom doesn't mean that you can't bring it in. And I'm sure you're finding ways to do that, whether it's through film, whether it's through song, whether it's through, you can still do all of those things in your classroom. And what I will say is what your classroom looks like matters, because if students are looking and they're seeing diverse representation of Francophone faces and people, then they already are starting to understand that the Francophonie does not look one way, that it is incredibly diverse. So that idea of like when we're setting up our classrooms, a lot of times we set it up for ourselves. But what's even more important is that we intentionally set it up for the outcome of students.
And that's a really great point that Monique makes. And that's an example of modeling, right? And modeling, I would argue, is one of the best ways to introduce real culturally responsive and representative pedagogy, especially to teachers and colleagues who are not sure what it looks like or who might be resistant. And it also, in a scenario where there's a lack of diversity, there's not a lot of diversity at all, maybe very little Black students or racialized students, but if the educator is still intentionally practicing how to include diverse voices, that makes a stronger educator, right? And that's because it matters just as much for classrooms and environments where the diversity may be low, as well as in classrooms where it's very, very diverse. Because this is just kind of an educational standard where everybody benefits, and the cultural awareness of these young people who are going to be citizens is deepened. So
Thank you so much, Monique and Joseph. Wow, we went to a little bit past, I think, just because so many people had so many questions, and you both had such great things to say. Again, thank you so much for your contribution and your amazing, and I know many, many, many hours of work into this module. And thank you so much for being here today. Is there any last minute words that you would like to say before we end this session?
I want to thank you, Flor. It's interesting that we're at this point. I really, really enjoyed it, and it's nice to have had a chance to reflect on the work as an educator and put it into this package. And I'm looking forward to sharing it. The time has kind of gone by, you know what I mean, in terms of back in the spring when you offered the opportunity for me and the marathon writing sessions in the summertime, and now here we are. So I really appreciate it. Yeah, man, I would just say counter narratives are really important. I like what Monique said about your classroom matters. And I also, because the way I think about this work sometimes is, how am I going to coach people? So I have these phrases, right? So, almost like small meaningful steps is a phrase, because it's almost like a strategy, especially as educators. What can I do? Well, you can do a lot of things, but the pace might be a small, meaningful step. That's a good metric that I use. And anyone that is in attendance, please feel free to send me any questions or comments to continue working with me. It's just joseph.galarango@tdsb.on.ca. Be happy to share any insights that I can. So thank you very, very much.
And again, huge thank you to Flor for navigating all of this. Joseph and I got a little sidetracked with the second version chapter that I guess is coming, but I definitely, would say that most recent, most consistent is not just for student marks. It's also about the way in which we approach anti-racist education. These steps, so Joseph talked about small, meaningful steps. For me, it's most consistent, most recent. What you are consistent in doing at this most recent time is important to continue, because you will then grow and build on that. So, Caitlin, whatever you are most consistent with and most recent with, keep going and add to it. There's no need to throw out everything you're doing. It's a matter of what are, as Joseph said, small, meaningful changes, but ones that are consistent, that you can maintain, because this is not it's a marathon, right? If this work is a marathon, you have to be able to maintain what you are doing, not for the benefit of just the students, but yourself as a person, is really important. And I can also be reached. If anybody has questions, I'd love to follow up. Yes, Flor put my email in the chat, so absolutely. And yeah, this was an amazing experience, and I learned so much. So thank you.
Yay, thank you both so much. And thank you for those that have attended. And of course, this is recorded, so it will be available to others that were not able to make it. So that's everything. Thank you so much, everyone, and hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you so